Welcome back, everybody. I'm excited about tonight. We're jumping into a new series, and I'm pretty excited about it. It's something that's been on my heart for a while, and it's really it's short. It's just 3 weeks, but it's on relationships, and we're going to take a closer look at building gospel-centered relationships. There's tons of relationships that we have, tons of this or that, whatever. But what we're going to start trying to do is just pick 3 areas and dive in and maybe talk through what those dynamics are, what it looks like, what makes sense, and maybe some things that don't make sense. And so we're going to take a stab at how to build gospel-centered relationships. Now, it's February, right? The month of love, as some might refer to it as. Did anybody have any Valentine's Day plans? Sauna. Chase was in the sauna on Valentine's Day. The more you get to know this guy, he lives there. Anybody have anything special? Valentine's Day, anything? Work? You went to Build-A-Bear? He went to Build-A-Bear to build a dog? That doesn't make sense. They got to branch out for the people like the returning customers that they've already built a bear. Do they want to build another bear? Let's make dogs an option, right? So, wow, that's fantastic. What'd you do, Matt? Oh. Yeah, Amber's like, I'm not even looking up. I know, some of you might be thinking all kinds of lovey-dovey stuff because that's what February is. I know for me, Valentine's Day, I got to baptize my son, Ezra, and thank you guys that were there. It was pretty cool, and to see him just looking up over, he when he got in, he couldn't see up over the bricks, and so he's on his tiptoes trying to see everybody. But it was good. But I still made time to be romantic and make sure that I took care of my wife. She loves Virgil's cream soda, and Darth Vader was on clearance, and I'm like, I am getting this. I wanted the ones that are this tall, that are about as tall as her, but apparently those aren't on clearance anymore. So, but I'm a Star Wars fan, and it just made sense. But here's what we're going to talk about. When we think about relationships, a lot of times, even though we're in this month of February where that's maybe the kind of relationship that's on people's minds when we say relationships, we're going to acknowledge that there's a lot of relationships, and all of those relationships impact every other relationship. We find ourselves in relationships that sometimes we don't even realize we're in. I think often we aren't even tuned into it to consider how many different things and relationships that we actually are in. We aren't aware of them. And so they all have impact on one another. And in these 3 weeks, we can't take on all of them. But what we're going to do is we're going to focus on 3 that I think are pretty relevant for this season of life. And so we're going to talk about friendship tonight. Next week, we're going to talk about dating. And the week after that, Gary's going to be talking about marriage. And so, again, there's way more. But what we're going to focus on is just 3 that seem to be often talked about or thought about, wrestled with in this season. And so that's not to say that those are the only ones, but if you think about relationships through this lens, that they are a state of connection, okay? I mean, a relationship it's a state of connection. There's a correlation. There's something going on. There's a link, right, of some kind. And it's expressed through our behaviors towards someone. I mean, that's when you say well, how do you relate to them, or how do you deal with them, right? There's some exchange going on. And so when you see relationships through that lens, it means that those connections, those correlations, those links, it doesn't mean they're all strong. They can be strong, they can be weak, and they can be something in between. They can be healthy. They can be sick or something in between. Those relationships, those connections, they can be known and they can be unknown. You can have connections with somebody and not even realize it. It's like when you learn that somebody else loves Chick-fil-A sauce and you're like, hey, we can be friends, right? And then you realize that they love Pizza King and you're like, I'm not your friend anymore. Some of you are like, oh, really? I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I have lots of friends that don't know what real pizza is. So it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. But here's what I'm saying. It's some of those connections, they're not all strong. They're not all healthy. They're not always something that we recognize that we actually have. They're not all good. Some of them are bad connections. If you allow your mind to see it that way, you can see that, think about our families. Some of us, those are good relationships. For some of us, they're not. But the reality is we have parents, we have siblings, we have cousins, we have crazy aunts and uncles, right? Anybody have a crazy aunt? Anybody? Yes, there was no hesitation on that, right? Anybody got a creeper uncle? Yeah. I was surprised that you admitted that, but we've got all these different relationships. Now you're like racking your brain like, this is online. This is going to be online. And I just called somebody out. No, but we have families. We have people that we work with. We have people that we work for. We have people that work for us. We have people that we encounter if you're at the checkout line and you're talking with somebody, there's actually a connection there. There is a relationship there. There's an exchange there. We just don't always acknowledge it as a relationship that's on our radar. You've got a relationship with the people that maybe bullied you in school. There's a relationship there. There's people that maybe you've defined them as an enemy in your life, or maybe for a season defined them as an enemy in your life. There's a relationship there. There's people that you go to church with, and there's people that you are the church with. There's people that you know what they believe, and there's people you don't know what they believe, and then there's people you know what they believe, and you know it's not the same as you. Those are still relationships. But if you see it through the lens that there's a correlation, there's a link, there's a connection of some kind, but it isn't necessarily always healthy and strong and good, it helps us see that relationships are worth talking about and talking through. But just because a relationship exists, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily healthy or strong or even gospel-centered, okay? And so, why does that even matter? Why would it even matter for something to be gospel-centered? Well, if we're going to be Christ followers, we've got to take pause and ask ourselves, what does it even mean to be gospel-centered? And so, we're going to take a look at some of that. And the first thing is this. This is the reason why it matters. It's because we have a first love. That's what the series is called, First Love. And the reason why is we have a first love. You'll hear me say this all the time about simply acknowledging who is our first love. And sometimes it's as simple as Sunday school, hearing it, but living it is a completely different story that unfolds. That first love that we have then shapes all that we are and therefore all that we do, just like what we talked about in the last several weeks. It shapes our lives. In 1 John, John is talking a lot about love. He's talking about love and love for one another. And in chapter 3 and 4, he's trying to unpack a little bit of what it means to be in relationship with other people that claim Christ as their first love. And so he's highlighting different verses where he's unpacking this in 1 John 3:16. He says, we know what love is because Christ gave up his life for us. And in verse 18, he says, we can't just say, I love you. We actually have to do this with more than just our words, but with our actions. Don't just say, I love you and not live, I love you. Right? How many times words are cheap so much of the time? And what John's trying to highlight is, okay, if you're going to be in relationship with other people, and it's going to be healthy, and it's going to be strong, and if it's going to have anything to do with the gospel, love has to be a part of it. And he's saying it's got to be a priority. Jesus commands us to love one another, right? We hear that over and over again in Scripture. Love one another. This is the command I give you. Love one another. Love one another. I don't like a lot of people, right? I'm not just talking about Ben here, right? Are there people that you struggle to like? Anybody honest with me tonight? Right? You're like, no, I love everybody, No, there's people that I love them, but I'd just soon strangle them too, right? There's moments where that thought just floats across your brain and you're just like, I want to strangle you right now, but I'm not. So that's when you say thanks, okay? Right? So I'm going to try not to derail myself. Specifically, though, in this letter that John is writing, in the next chapter, as he's trying to help them understand that if we're going to be in a relationship with other people, we've got to unpack this idea of belonging and that we belong to Christ, that he is who we belong to, and that means we love one another. And I know it seems so simple. It just seems so hard to actually live out. In verse 16 of chapter 4 is where John says, God is love. God is love, and all who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. Let me read that again. God is love, and all who live in love live in God, and God lives in them. We just get mixed up on what real love actually looks like. In verse 19, he says, we love each other as a result of his loving us first. And that is the lens for this whole series. That's the concept of, because he loved us first, our response is to love him back. And here's something, if you've been with us for a while, you've heard me say this. As a dad, as a husband, I'm constantly trying to invest into my marriage and into my kiddos because I recognize this is my window to give them definition of who they are. And I recognize that who I am now has everything to do with who they will be 20 years down the road, whether for good or for worse. And one of the things we talk about often is we build the Team Woods culture code. And we've got all these phrases that we're trying to teach our children around. And we're just forming it. We're still trying to form it. We're almost 9 years into this parenting gig, and it's like this rough draft that keeps getting changed. But the first one doesn't change. And it's this: love Jesus first. And it's rooted in this because he loves us first, and our response is to love him back. And so our response is to love Jesus first. Think about every point of your life, every decision that you make, whether big or small or something in between. Let that be your filter, and be surprised how much of your life will maybe change. Think about the things that you do day to day. Ask yourself, does this reflect that I love Jesus first? That he gets the best of me? Not my leftovers. He gets my best. So I want that on your heart, this idea of love Jesus first. And when he is our first love, our lives reflect that. Our words reflect that. Our thoughts reflect that. Our actions, our prayers, and therefore our relationships reflect that he is our first love. And that means that my heart is then aligned to the heart of Christ. If he gets my best and he gets my first, that means that my heart is in alignment to his. And that means the more I hang out with him, the more I begin to not just love what he loves, but I love who he loves. Because the more you hang out with him, the more he rubs off on you. And so when you love him first and your heart is in alignment to him, it's going to look a certain way, even when it is hard to actually live this stuff out. It doesn't change that our hearts must be in alignment with him. And I'll say this: if Christ is not the center of us, he won't be the center of any of your relationships. If Jesus is not the center of you, you can't have gospel-centered relationships. They won't exist. Because if he's not the center of you, then the center is something else. How often do we find ourselves in relationships, anything? You can probably scan through your brain right now and rattle off 5 or 6 relationships through the lens that we've just defined and recognize my foundation in that relationship, our focal point, is not gospel. And so what we're going to try and unpack through this is how we can build gospel-centered relationships, how we can allow all of the things that are competing against that focal point of loving Jesus first, how we can get them out of the way and focus on what matters most. And that's the challenge, is that he become the center of our relationships. And that's the lens for this whole series. And tonight we're talking about friendships, these relationships of mutual affection, these relationships that reflect this bond that seems special, right? Like when you think of a friend, what do you think of? What comes to mind? Gretchen, see, you have a name. What comes to mind when you think of a friend? Trust. Somebody's got your back. Respect. Laughing. At and with, right? Saunas. Somebody that when you go to their house, your phone automatically connects to the Wi-Fi, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, you're like, oh, yeah. And now you're all like, next time you go to somebody's house or their apartment and you don't connect, you're like, we're not friends, are we? Ben said we're not friends unless you give me your password so I can drain your bandwidth here, you know? All my family was here this weekend to celebrate Ezra's baptism, and like we're trying to watch something, and we can't because all my nephews are on their devices, and it's like, what is happening? Our house is going to implode. But it's because we share our Wi-Fi with our family. But, yeah, with our family. You know, and some of you actually have it too. So, but it's this relationship of mutual affection, this interpersonal bond. But the connection is assumed to be strong, right? Like if you're going to say that you're friends with somebody, you almost assume that it's strong. But it's not always strong because sometimes friends hurt us. Sometimes friends like take advantage of us. Sometimes they hurt us on purpose. Sometimes they hurt us by accident. And then that's when people say, well, they're not a very good friend, are they? Or like when you're little, it's like, well, you just stop being their friend. And I don't know if that's the healthiest thing, but that's our assumption. That's what I think what happens. I mean, we've all got BFFs, right? Don't you all have somebody in your life that you would say is your best friend, right? Not always. But here's the deal. If you have somebody that you would say is your best, it doesn't necessarily mean you've got somebody that's your worst, though somebody maybe just popped into your brain. But it implies that there's a spectrum because not everybody can be your best. Not everybody can be besties or whatever you call it, right? Not everybody can be, Bailey's like, yeah, you can call it that. No, like it implies that that's not always the case. And so I think there's a spectrum, and you can see that there's several stopping points along the way. One of the things I think about is like how friendships even start. Like sometimes it's like an acquaintance. Like you ever like, hey, you know so-and-so? And you're like, well, I know they exist, but I don't know them, right? Like I know their name. When I first moved here, I was from Illinois. I didn't know hardly anybody, and everyone immediately assumed that I knew everyone that had been on staff at Northside ever. And they start like, oh, well, you know so-and-so. I'm like, I have no idea who you're talking about. But I've heard the name only from your paragraph from before, right? But you know what I'm saying? It's like, you know they exist, and then you maybe meet them, and it's an acquaintance. And maybe sometime down the road, you actually get to hang out with them, and you have a conversation that was more than just something surface level. And then you're like, well, I don't just, I've not just heard of them, I kind of slightly know them. And so maybe we're like, there's an association here. Like we kind of, like you move from acquaintance to association. And then you kind of find yourself being like, all right, we're hanging out, we're friends. Like there's maybe room to be companions, right? Where you're actually going somewhere together. You can scour the internet. There's tons of ways of people break this stuff down. I think one of the most interesting that I came across is this idea of contact friends, common friends, confirmed friends, community friends, and committed friends. See, it's a spectrum. Like you don't normally just walk into a conversation and next thing you know, you're like committed friends, but you recognize that you maybe have something in common, or you recognize that there's simply starting with contact. There's proximity happening, right? But there's a progression that then deepens into committed friendship. And so yes, we are to love all. I mean, we are called to love everybody, but a deep, lasting, gospel-centered relationship, it's always going to be shaped by our deep, lasting relationship with Christ. The only way for it to be a gospel-centered relationship is for our lives to be centered on the gospel. And so it takes my heart to John 15, and so I'm going to just read something to you real quick. We can maybe sometime do a whole series on just John 15, but this idea of abiding in him and remaining in him, when Jesus is talking about remain in me and I remain in you, and love. He keeps talking about this is what it looks like. But in chapter 15 of John, verse 13, 14, and 15, he says this, and here is how to measure it. Because first he says, I command you to love each other in the same way that I love you. Okay, so he's talking to his disciples. Love each other in the same way that I love you. And here's how to measure it. The greatest love is shown when people lay down their lives for their friends. You are my friends if you obey me. I no longer call you servants because a master doesn't confide in his servants. Now you are my friends since I have told you everything the Father told me. Okay? So what we see in this is what it looks like to establish relationship, friendship with Christ. Now, when you hear the phrase, you are my friends if you obey me, that's Jesus talking. Don't try that with your friends, okay? Don't walk up and be like, hey, Jesus says you have to obey me or we can't be friends, okay? That is called heresy, okay? So like, you know what I'm saying? Like when Jesus says, he's saying this is what it means to be in relationship with me. It means that you obey my commands. And one of my commands is love one another in the same way that I love you. He's establishing what a friendship looks like. And if the greatest love is shown by the way we lay down our lives for friends, there's something to be said there. I mean, we don't like to think about that kind of stuff, but that's what he's done so that we can be in relationship with him, the creator of the universe, the Holy of Holies. And we're this messed up people, dirty and filthy. And the only way we can be in relationship with him is because of his sacrifice for us. And he even says this, he's told his disciples, I've told you everything that the Father told me. So nothing stands between him and them. That's what it means to be in relationship with Christ. And so he is this perfect example of a true friend because of his sacrifice for us, for friends. We become his friend when we put our trust in him. So we're just going to take a quick look at some stories that'll maybe help us bring out some ideas of what it can look like and should look like to be in healthy, strong, gospel-centered relationships. And one of the first ones that comes to my mind when I was thinking through this was David and Jonathan back in the Old Testament. And I'm going to read a couple little passages. It's a pretty great story, longer than we have time for. But you've got David here, okay? And David has been anointed to be the next king, all right? He's also just killed Goliath, all right? And so he's kind of on an upward swing of popularity, okay? And Saul, the king, is not pumped about that. And he has a son named Jonathan, all right? And so let me read this. It's chapter 18 of 1 Samuel, just the first 4 verses. After David had finished talking with Saul, that's the king, he met Jonathan, the king's son. There was an immediate bond of love between them, and they became the best of friends. From that day on, Saul kept David with him at the palace and wouldn't let him return home. See, he's concerned. He doesn't want to let David kind of go off and gain more popularity. And Jonathan made a special vow to be David's friend. And he sealed the pact by giving him his robe, tunic, sword, bow, and belt. You ever made a pact with a friend? You're like, yes, we've got covenants, right? No, like, I mean, right? Yeah, I gave somebody my belt and my tunic and, my crossbow and, or like my Xbox controller. Like we have a pact. Right? Now think about it. There's something special going on here. It's saying there was an immediate bond between them. That they chose this. They chose to be friends. And they chose to become the best of friends. That means that they let nothing between them. And they established a special vow and they sealed it with symbolic gifts. Okay? Again, choice and commitment. And as the story goes on, Saul is constantly trying to kill David. He's trying to take him out. And what you'll find is over and over again, he's threatened by him. He's jealous. He's throwing spears at him while he's playing the harp. Crazy things like that. And David apparently had cat-like reflexes, or Saul was really bad at throwing spears, because it happened a few times. And he even threw spears at his son Jonathan, because Jonathan had this commitment to David, because his son was a man of integrity, a man after God's own heart. Well, as he's trying to kill him and over and everything, all these plans keep coming back to David, all these attempts. And then you find this in the next chapter, in chapter 19. Let me read just a short exchange that happens here. The next morning, and this is verse 4 of chapter 19, the next morning Jonathan spoke with his father about David, saying many good things about him. He says, please don't sin against David, Jonathan pleaded. He's never done anything to harm you. He's always helped you in any way he could. Have you forgotten about the time he risked his life to kill the Philistine giant, and how the Lord brought a great victory to Israel as a result? You were certainly happy about it then. Why should you murder an innocent man like David? There's no reason for it at all. So Saul listened to Jonathan and vowed, another vow, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be killed. Afterward, Jonathan called David and told him what had happened. Then he took David to see Saul, and everything was as it had been before. So you've got this exchange where Jonathan, the son of the king, goes to bat for David. Like, he's speaking to the king. And just because he's the king's son, that doesn't mean he has freedom to speak to the king whenever he wants or however he wants. But this is worth it to him to defend his friend, to stand up for his friend. And so he goes to bat for him. And Jonathan later helps David escape after Saul tries to kill him again and again. And in verse 17 of chapter 20, it says that Jonathan loved David as much as he loved himself. Jonathan was the rightful heir to the throne. He was the son of the king. But his friendship to David trumped his personal priorities of what everyone expected of him. He chose this friendship because this friendship meant more. He stood up for David. That's what friends do. You can see character traits that come out in this. There's tons of them. There's integrity. There's trust. He's keeping his word. It's hard to sometimes keep our word, right? When our friends share something with us that maybe we know is going to harm them, it's hard to keep that quiet. It's hard to maintain trust because our human nature, our sinful nature, is breaking trust all the time. You see evidence of confidence because of commitments, and you see evidence of putting someone else before himself. There's a vow here, and David would do the same thing for Jonathan. Here's another story in the Bible, Ruth and Naomi. Another Old Testament story where you've got Naomi, and she's married to a dude named Elimelech, and she's got some sons, and they all die. Both her two sons who were married to Moabite women. The two sons die, and her husband dies, and so it's her and her daughters-in-law, okay? And she is like, okay, you need to go home. You need to go back home and hang with your people and let them take care of you because you're too young. Like, you've got families that you could have ahead of you. And they both are like, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. Like, we want to stick with you. Well, then finally, she says, no, you need to get out of here. I'm doing what's best for you. And she tells them, yeah, you've got to go. And Orpah, she says, okay, I'll go. But Ruth says this in chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. Ruth replied, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. I will go wherever you go and live wherever you live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I will die where you die and will be buried there. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. Friendship. We're not just talking about hanging out here. I will go where you go. I will live where you live. The people that you bring into your life will be the people that I bring into my life. The God that you serve will be the God that I serve. And where I die, it's going to be where you die because nothing's going to separate us. These are strong biblical examples of friendship, of what true friendship actually is. Because friends stick together. They're like-minded. And if you think about it, friendships, they begin as individuals that kind of allow themselves to be connected, but it's only as strong, it's only as close as you choose to make it. That's why it takes investment, right? You don't just magically become best friends. Maybe sometimes you have the same interests, and it starts there, but it can't end there, because then it just stays the same. And so there's some things that you can pull from that. Friends, it's someone that you respect and someone that respects you. Someone that you can confide in with complete trust. And that's tough. Because sometimes it's hard to trust people, especially if they've broken that trust or they've taken something that you've shared with them and they've shared it with other people that they said they wouldn't. It's hard. It's hard to do that. A friend is someone that you can be yourself with and you're not going to be or feel judged for being you. It's someone that is not going to judge you, but it's going to hold you accountable, because that's the difference. It's someone that's still going to confront you. It's somebody that's going to bust your chops, but it's because they love you. That's the difference, because a lot of times, if the relationship isn't there and you try to confront somebody, that's called judgment, okay? Stop it, okay? Just don't do that, right? But when there's a relationship that exists and it's a healthy one and it's a strong one, because how many of us have maybe found ourselves on roads we know we didn't belong on, and someone took the time to not just confront us, but to help lead us home? Because somebody ran out into the woods to say, you know what you're doing is not what's best for you, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm sticking with you, and where we go, we will go together. I mean, that's what friends do. That's what friends are. Choosing to belong with, choosing to be present with in times of both joy and struggle. Gospel-centered friendships are shaped around the gospel. That means when Jesus is our first love, the gospel goes where we go. If the gospel is in us, the gospel goes with us. And it is to be breathed into every relationship that we have. That's why you have no idea what it could do to someone at the line at Kroger when you're just kind to them. That's why you have no idea what it could do to somebody to just listen, because you were paying enough attention to recognize that their heart is broken and they just need somebody to listen. It's what gives space for true friendships. Friendships believe in they believe in each other. They cheer each other on. They comfort and they confront. Friends comfort and confront. They understand. They trust and can be trusted. They help and they hold. They stick up for you. They stay in the trenches with you. So here's my encouragement. Pick your friends wisely. The Scripture has a ton to tell you about how to pick your friends wisely. There's tons of proverbs about friendship, about how you need to look for character traits in people that exude grace and exude truth, and where those meet is love, okay? Look for those character traits and choose your friends wisely. Paul sums it up well in 1 Corinthians 15:33 when he says, bad company corrupts good character. Now that doesn't mean don't let anybody in your life that's got issues. No, it doesn't mean that. What he's talking to is the church, and he's telling them, guys, you're not aware of your sphere of influence. You're allowing people to not hear the gospel because you're in the way of the gospel getting to them, and you're the ones that are to be bringing the gospel to them. You hang out with people that have more influence over you, you'll keep the gospel from entering into their life when you were the one maybe called to bring it to them. Paul's got a lot more to say about that, but basically know your influence, know your sphere of influence. And don't just pick your friends wisely, treat your friends well. Treat your friends well. Luke 6:31, Jesus, that's when he says, do to others as you would have them do to you. That's tough though, right? It's tough to actually be kind to somebody when you're not always in the mood to be kind to them. Romans 12:10, Paul is coaching the church again on how to live in relationship with one another. He says, love each other with genuine affection and take delight in honoring each other. When was the last time you honored somebody? Like, think about that. Think about when was the last time that you were like, I want to go out of my way to honor my friend. And maybe the question is, what does that even look like? Well, it depends on how close you are friends. Because if you know them well, you'll know what would bring them honor. But he says, love each other with genuine affection and take delight in honoring each other. And we've looked at this passage before, but it's worth reading again. Ephesians 4:29 through 32. Let me read that real quick. Ephesians 4:29. Says this, Paul is talking, he says, don't use foul or abusive language. Let everything you say be good and helpful, so that your words will be an encouragement to those who hear them. Don't be a turd. Be encouraging. Let what comes out of your mouth encourage someone, not tear them down. And do not bring sorrow to God's Holy Spirit by the way you live. Remember, He is the one who has identified you as His own. You belong to Him, right? Guaranteeing that you will be saved on the day of redemption. He says, get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of malicious behavior. Get rid of them. Instead, be kind to each other. Be tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God, through Christ, has forgiven you. Be a constant encourager. Build each other up. And if your friends aren't doing that, they maybe aren't friends. That doesn't mean you can't change that, but it means that maybe that the gospel's not the center of the relationship. Get rid of whatever doesn't belong. Be kind, be tenderhearted, be forgiving. Paul, again, he's talking to the church in Colossians here, in chapter 3, verse 12. He says, since God chose you to be the holy people whom He loves, you must clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. You must make allowance for each other's faults and forgive the person who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. And the most important piece of clothing you must wear is love. Love is what binds us all together in perfect harmony. What are you wearing? Like, what is your life wearing? Is it evident in your life, these things? Humility and gentleness and patience. I mean, we've got to be able to forgive one another and recognize that we need them to forgive us. This is what it comes down to. If Christ is the center of you, these qualities, these character traits, they begin to shine and they begin to be the center of all of your relationships. They begin to be at the center of our friendships specifically. But many of our friendships, we recognize, are based on something else. They're centered around so many other things that are competing for our first love. And so, questions that we need to land with is, who's your first love? Who gets your best? Who is it? What is it? That's worth wrestling with. Because we got a lot of things that will go for that throne. A lot of things in our lives that will go for that throne. What are your friendships centered on? And some of them, they may start with a shared school schedule. Some of them may start with Frisbee in the park. Some of them may start with being in the gym and recognizing that, hey, you need somebody to spot you. Sometimes a friendship can begin just because you met somebody somewhere and they made you laugh. But if it's going to be anything more, you have to move it in the direction of making the gospel the center. It may start with an immediate connection. It may even start with conflict. You ever had somebody that was your first encounter was conflict and now you're friends? That's called redemption. That's called the gospel. See what I'm saying? We've got to ask ourselves, if they're going to end up gospel-centered, we've got to be able to be the ones that allow the gospel to be the center. And here's the deal. Some of us have been pretty lousy friends. Some of us maybe have some people in our lives that it's time to say, I'm sorry to, because we've skirted the truth, or maybe we've twisted the truth, or we've said that, I'm looking out for you when we're not really. Maybe there's people in our lives that we need to call, or don't just text. Maybe we need to go to them and say, I'm sorry, I've not been the friend that I was supposed to be. Maybe some of us, we're on the other side of it, and we've been hurt. And we don't know how to trust other people now. Maybe it's time to just let your guard down a little bit. Maybe, though, some of us, we've been the ones that have felt left out. Simply that nobody wanted to take the time to be our friend. It's a lonely place to hang out. I'm no stranger to that. Sometimes people will assume things of you that aren't true. The reality is we're made for relationships. And we got to have people that we lock arms with. And friendships, when they're centered on the gospel, the world gets a glimpse of who Jesus really is and that he's coming for them. So, from here, let me just ask you, who's your first love? And who's at the center? Because that'll shape everything. Let me pray. I'm going to get in a group.